I'm Andrew Levine, the CEO of Koinos Group, inventors of Koinos, the blockchain with no fees.
And I'm Adam, founder of GFAM, a platform that completely decentralizes earnings for content creators.
And this is our decentralized future, where we talk about issues and interview people on the cutting edge of technology to help prepare you for a more decentralized future.
Today, we don't have Andrew, but we do have Chris Lawrence of the Interledger Foundation. How are you, Chris?
Good. How are you, Adam? Thanks for
Not
having
too
me.
bad. So, from what I understand about the Interledger Foundation, you all think the internet is just fine as it is. Is that correct?
No, um, no, I don't. I don't think that's our starting thesis. I'd say here's what I would say. I think we see the internet is many things, first of all, right? So, it's a giant ecosystem where some things can be healthy and some things can be broken at the same time. So I think it's always important to think of it as a system and not a monolith. And so there's plenty of things on the internet that are working just fine. And, no one, especially after the last 18 plus months, can think of their lives without it. And if you are unfortunate enough to have a life without it, you are, even more disadvantaged than you were even just a couple of years ago. So, but we also understand and see that how money works on the web, how finance works on the web is basically living in a 21st century models in a 21st century world. And that's beginning problematic. That means there's a drive towards closed systems and walled gardens. There's a drive towards winner take all mentality. And there is basically a moment of victory for corporations owning the web in the similar ways that they own every other part of our media landscape. All of that actually doesn't work like the internet, isn't of the spirit of what gave us the internet that we have today, which is more distributed, more democratic, more of a plurality of voices, and at its core, interoperability. And that a lot of the things that I've mentioned really are starting to really slice deeply into making the web, which is interoperable by existence and design, into something that is way more siloed. And so as moneyed interest, a big corporate interest, explode, then that interoperability is declining at just warp speed. And so our sort of starting philosophy is that if we believe in global financial inclusion, and we believe that the internet is probably the best path towards that, or really the only path towards that to a large degree, then there's work to be done to ensure that that's the case.
Awesome. So what are you going to do about it?
Well, we're doing a number of things. One, the Interledger Foundation is still relatively new. I think we've been in existence about a year. And we exist to do a number of things, but we really do exist to build to steward two core pieces of open technology that we hope we're working towards have a solution to the problems that I've just named. And that is the Interledger protocol and the Web Monetization API, or proposed standard. So we steward those pieces of technology. So there's a technological stewardship in an open source project capacity. But we also need to advance and gain adoption and fund innovation within that as well. The ecosystem for that technology is still relatively young. It's still relatively experimental. And it, as I mentioned before, it sort of flies in the face of what sort of the headwinds, so to speak. So we need, basically what we're doing is funding the advancement of what I just mentioned. And funding can look like a number of different things. It can be direct grants. It can be underwriting programs. It can be funding thought leadership and intellectual understanding of these issues. It can be sort of soft power type things in terms of trying to influence companies, governments to think a bit different and help them to solve problems. They might understand the things that we're framing, but they don't necessarily have solutions or where to even start on finding solutions. So we exist to do all of those things. Probably the most mature program that we have to date is the Grant for the Web program, which is, funding experiments within everything I just focused on, probably with a bit of a focus on the web monetization standard. But quite frankly, over the about 2 years that we've been building the Grant for the Web program, what we've realized that is it's hard to go fast with web monetization if the Interledger protocol, both at a technological level and an ideas level, isn't more robust. And so, it's a classic cart before the horse type of cliche. And so a little bit is we've sort of not restructured fully or even really at all, but what we've come to understand is that if we aren't funding, if we aren't advancing the core technology and ideas, then web monetization has a hard time finding traction, right? It is the feature of the ecosystem. It's not the ecosystem itself.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Before we get into web monetization a bit more, can you, I don't know, just explain what your role is at the Interledger Foundation? What are you doing there?
So I am the senior program manager, along with my colleague Erica Drushka, of the Grant for the Web program. So Erica and I sort of took Grant for the Web as a idea and a concept and a stash of funds into a viable and active program. Through that, we're, sort of, as I just mentioned, we're starting to realize that through the Interledger Foundation, that we also have to build a bigger world in which those ideas can take root. So we're also, we're only a staff of 5 at the Interledger Foundation. So we wear many hats. But we also wake up every day thinking about, how does Interledger Foundation, become a internet nonprofit that is inspiring, funding, and moving the world forward into our mission.
Yeah, it's an amazing mission and something that has been very close to my heart for quite some time now. So the Interledger protocol is basically technology that helps web monetization, which is really a subscriber kind of model where a subscriber who can subscribe to like many different things will basically end up paying a creator for the time that they spend on a piece of content. So really the whole protocol is to help creators earn from their creations. Is that kind of right?
Yes, that isn't wrong.
Okay.
But I would say it's also not the totality.
Okay.
So, and I think that's a really important distinction, right? Because what you described is a version of web monetization, streaming payments, subscription models, and that is what works the best right now. But technically, and to some degree right now, theoretically, I want to underscore that, right? That the point of this is that not all those pieces in the ecosystem are robust enough to make this a declarative statement, but it should be able to do more than that, right? And so streaming payments to a content creator is but one thing that it can do. And so we need to flesh out more things that it can do. And even in the content creator use case, it's limiting, because, what if you want to make a single payment? What if you want to toggle the amount of your stream? What if you want to do something reoccurring? What if you want to use that browser-based payment capability to subscribe to something or set something to reoccur,
or split against other creators?
Exactly. So even in the world of web monetization, the current model is interesting, potentially game-changing. People are really starting to experiment and even have some limited success. But it almost immediately opens up why can't I do X, Y, and Z? And even when you get out of what the web monetization piece might be in terms of X, Y, and Z, then, and you look, which then brings you to the Interledger protocol. Why aren't we using a borderless, currency agnostic, open protocol that potentially greatly enhances the internet, the web, to work differently, to build models that are different or and sometimes even in opposition to the current ones to flourish? And so I think that's one of the big ahas that we've had that sort of motivated the creation of the Interledger Foundation, created, sort of even at the grant for the web level, some of our messaging and marketing was to expand it into those bigger possibilities too. Because the early adopters, the first ins, are not exclusively, but substantially our grantees are quickly figuring out like, oh, the potential here is way more vast in these sort of use cases that are in front of me right now.
One thing I particularly like about this program that you're running is that it's kind of decentralized in itself, in that spending time with a lot of the people in the web monetization field, and especially with the grantees, you get to see that a lot of funding models have been fairly centralized, in that the same groups of people get this, get the money to build, or get the capital to build the things that they want to build. And so Grant for the Web has been particularly focused on decentralizing capital models and getting funds out to groups and groups of people that don't normally get funding. Has that been accidental? Has that been a focus of yours? How did you get there?
It was definitely intentional. So right. I think, I want to name that we started with that intention. Now, whether how successful we are yet, or, in results or process, I think it's a work in, it's a work in progress. It's
yeah. I mean, this is just your first year or two in this program.
Yeah, but I think there's a few things that allowed us, that aided our intention. One, we aren't necessarily, and our path is certainly not necessarily the same as traditional philanthropy. So, and that's not, I'm not here to decry that. And we've begged, borrowed, and stealed lots of stuff from them. And, we would love to be, one of our longer goals is to be seen, shoulder to shoulder with some of those. Yep. But we can be more agile. In some ways, we're a little bit of a hybrid of a traditional philanthropy and, kind of more agile venture capital models. And so we've designed the program to sort of take some of the better aspects of both of those and avoid some of the pitfalls of both of those as well, and design that way, which means things like, we can grant make globally. We can give to individuals, companies, governments, organizations. We've, tried to build the program so that it can give funds to all these kind of different entities. Often in, traditional philanthropy, there's a set amount of kind of organizations that can take in the funds. We also, and this is legwork, and we're not anywhere near successful at this yet. But as you said, it's also just being in spaces where these kind of opportunities aren't necessarily shared, understood. And from an equity standpoint, that means that you need, in those new communities or new spaces, or where these ideas at many levels, the tech, grants in general, all of these things are new or are not the norm. And so some of the equity part is being in those spaces for longer and taking a slower approach. So what's it like to bring a community along, or what's it like to activate key people to advance these ideas, or what it's like to walk these opportunities to folks and make sure that it's in their purview or in their line of sight, so to speak. Because you're right. And this, generally it's especially in philanthropy, grant making, et cetera, funding broadly, it's a game, right? And knowledge is power, like anywhere else. So if you know where to look, you know where to go, you can be proactive, and then you kind of continually get served, right? Like so and of course we're going to take advantage of some of that too. And, there's going to be lots of folks that are tuned to that are going to know who we are, but we have to make an extra effort to expand that pipeline.
Yeah, and I think a benefit to you is that you'll have access to ideas that have traditionally gone unfunded because of the people that have those ideas. So potentially, like, there's a lot of like world-changing stuff that you might have access to that has just been ignored for the previous hundreds of years, you know. So that's really exciting to me. And the web monetization community is a really exciting one to me, and I'm sure to lots of other people, because of all the ideas that you get shown, all the ideas that you become a part of. So this podcast particularly does, we're really making it a lot for developers. So from a developer point of view, what are you kind of hoping to get out of the grant for the web process? I noticed there are particular grants for technology building and that sort of stuff. So yeah, you're obviously looking for developers to help build the web monetization space, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair. I think what we'd love to see is communities or a cohort or generations of developers who understand this technology and work that into their toolbox. And even when projects don't, quote unquote, succeed, you've got a developer base that greatly understands this, or understands where that part failed, has a new idea about how to make it work, has gone deep into documentation, or has built things in the ecosystem, has contributed to the open code of things like Interledger protocol, or participated in something like Rafiki. So, or even produced a proof of concept that for whatever reason didn't work, but gives a very high level blueprint for others to follow. Open source is, to me, open source isn't just a technology development mechanism. It's also a mind state that transcends technology, and I think improves the technologists that come along as well, in that it's really about a sharing of ideas. It's about a learning from others, and it's about, it's collectivism. It's understanding that a collective is stronger than an individual, which, is not the dominant paradigm in most of our discourse and most of the society. So it's counterintuitive for people, and it's in some ways counter-revolutionary in terms of, we build better together. And so that means that we have to be willing to fund things that are going to fail, to create almost the playgrounds, right? The experimental spaces, the labs, if you're a real nerd, the X-Men danger room of what, developers and engineers that are going to cut their teeth on this stuff, so that even 3, 5, 10 years from now, this is just integrating into their workflow about how they build on the web.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about open source is, like, from a visual point of view, you have everything expanding out in every direction all the time. So, like, it's not a path, it's just like a series of explosions that happen that all potentially help each other. And that's how you really get the good stuff, as long as good people are working on it. And I think the open source community tends to have a lot of people that build just to see if something works, which is amazing, and not how companies work in the slightest.
Yeah. And, and that's where I've always worked and thought about these things at an intersection, right? Because it's also the open culture movement. And there's things that that organizations like Creative Commons do. So sort of think about, like, how do we think about all of this stuff a little bit differently? And then in interaction with each other, because, ultimately all ideas, concepts, content, and code are all, like, these things are becoming less and less easy to distinguish amongst themselves. So, we need these kind of, an open mindset on all of those things. And so if you bring it back to money, I mean, what does it say about a more financially inclusive world where we're asking, and this is in this is in emerging markets, this is in established markets, this is in the, the global South, the West, all of the ways that you slice and dice that. we're being asked to move into highly proprietary walled gardens, which basically mean in the end, we can do less with our money.
Yeah.
You know, they become incredibly limiting about what we actually do with our own resources. And so, you know, and that's kind of frightening, right? Like, you don't want to have to pick, you know, you don't want to make a choice like joining the MasterCard network or something, you know, and I'm not talking about getting their credit card. I'm talking about like the payment pipes, you know, especially, you know, in emerging markets where that's starting to become dominant, and you know, the Stripes and the PayPals of the world are the same thing. Like you pick something and then you just have to hope and that other people join you. But think of how limiting that is on how you use or make resources.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting recently how OnlyFans, the platform, was starting to not accept adult content. And potentially that was because of MasterCard or Visa limiting the type of content that they could create, which is just so wild to me. Like the fact that a financial payment system might have that influence, or investors might have that influence, is kind of really scary. The 22nd of September is the deadline for grant for the web proposals. And you're looking for a whole range of different proposals. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. So this, you know, Grant for the Web is looking to have a number of different grant streams, and we've experimented and played with some. And the one that's sort of the most mature is this semi-regular, and hope we shouldn't become more regular. I think we're looking to maybe doing a version of this particular one, like maybe twice a year. And this is experimental funding, right? This isn't going to build big ecosystem building blocks. It's not going to underwrite a organization or company taking a bold step into this space. We'll have other funding mechanisms for that. But this one is more at the experimental level. It's more at the intersection of content, tooling, and building an intellectual space for this kind of stuff as well. And so the Maxim Award is 100,000. They tier out in three ways: up to 15,000 we call a Spark grant, up to 50 we call a mid-level, and up to 100 is a flagship. And a new wrinkle in this call for proposals, because we basically ran this one other time publicly, and then we did kind of a semi-public round where we gave folks that weren't successful the first time a second chance. So really, in the end, this is our third kick at the can at this version of this call for proposals. And the one new wrinkle this time is that we actually have categories. And basically, these categories respond to what we were seeing in the types of projects that were finding success. And I don't necessarily mean finding success in terms of like market penetration. I mean finding success in learning something, working towards their end goals, contributing to a larger knowledge base, building people and organizations that know how to work in the space. And those were starting to fall into what we codified into 4 categories. And so one is maybe the most obvious, and the one that we sort of was our big goal when we launched 2 years ago was content creators, content providers. And so what we want, so that one is, I think we call it web monetized content business plans. And so what we're seeing is a lot of people know how to make content. They might be struggling with if anyone cares, if they're making any revenue from it, et cetera. So we wanted to couple having a really explicit way in which you're going to use or leverage or experiment with web monetization, along with the content that you're creating. So that category is a little bit more focused on, you may have a piece of content, you may even be using grant funds to underwrite a piece of content, but the sort of quality of the proposal and what eventually get funded will be more on the business plan on how to use web monetization, even in an experimental way. So that's one. The second is, this is a new area without a ton of research. And one of the things that was super exciting about our first couple of rounds of grant making was that some of the most successful pieces of it were actually research, whether that was like UX, UI design, like how do you communicate people about this opportunity or about web monetization, or it was about different funding models with web monetization being one of a bouquet of options. It was research, white papers and small code bases. So we wanted to really zero in funding people to help build that knowledge base. Third, is for the techies out there, it's prototypes, it's proof of concepts. I have a thing I want to build. I've got a, maybe it is a code library or code base, or maybe it's a working prototype or proof of concept. So there's still that path. And then fourth, because what we're really seeing is if there's nobody that uses this stuff, if there's nobody from a user perspective, from a audience perspective, from a public awareness perspective, then the best ideas are gonna dry on the vine. So we also have a public education and advocacy track. Who's out there talking about these things? Who's maybe framing why this is a potential alternative to programmatic advertising or to gaming your YouTube algorithm. So we also need folks that are out there in those kind of public spaces helping to advance these ideas. So we split it's into these 4 categories. We probably didn't get it all right. But we think it helps 2 ways. One, it gives more specific projects with more specific goals with that framing, and it invites more people in. It's not just for developers, right? It could be for a public advocacy campaign, or can be for research. It lets others sort of see where they might play in the space.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that there's a research component. I love that there's an educational component. Yeah, I think that will really help. And obviously, we need content consumers that care about this sort of stuff and care about subscribing and all that sort of stuff. So thank you very much, Chris. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you. I hope you get an amazing crop of grants in the next couple of weeks. And yeah, I'm really excited to see what comes out of this next round of grants.
Well, thank you, Adam, for having me. As always, you've been, emerging ecosystems need champions, they need laborers, they need advocates, and you've been all 3. So thank you for everything you've done.